Malcolm Harris held the glowing iron in his scarred hands, the heat biting into the calluses that years of labor had built shaping chains meant to shackle men like himself. But on this heavy Louisiana night, those chains would be used for something very different. The overseer who once found joy in cracking his whip was about to taste his own lesson, to know what it meant to be trapped, to hear the grinding hunger of the sugar mill that had already swallowed so many lives. Malcolm had waited for this moment through long years of silence and suffering, planning every step. And now the night had come when power would shift in the most violent way possible. The year was 1857, and the Beaumont plantation spread across 2,000 acres of rich delta soil. Waves of sugarcane swayed in the thick breeze, carrying both the sweetness of molasses and the stench of misery. At its center stood a mansion painted white as bone, a monument to wealth, built upon the labor of 300 enslaved men and women. Among them was Malcolm Harris, a man unlike the others. He stood 6'4", broad as an oak, his dark skin marked by burns from the forge where he shaped the tools of captivity. His massive hands could bend iron with the grace of an artist. Yet those same hands were never allowed to sign his own name or caress his wife without permission. The true heart of the plantation was the sugar mill, a beast of iron and wood, whose rollers crushed cane with relentless force. To Malcolm, it was not just a machine, but a monster swallowing men whole with the same indifference it gave to stalks of cane. He had seen arms torn away, fingers mangled, even bodies dragged in entirely, their screams cut short beneath the weight of progress and profit. Each season, from sunrise to sunset, the mill never stopped. Its grinding rhythm became the cruel heartbeat of the plantation, producing the white crystals that decorated the tables of wealthy families while mocking the lives it consumed. Malcolm's forge sat close enough to hear every scream, every snap of bone, every wet crunch that came when flesh met steel. His job was to keep the mill alive, to oil its gears, to mend its teeth, to ensure the monster never failed in its task of feeding on human bodies and sweat. Watching over it all was Roderick Dwyer, the overseer. He was tall and thin, his gray eyes colder than iron, his whip coiled at his side like a snake that struck with no warning. His joy came from standing at the mill during harvest, lips curled in a cruel smirk as workers risked their limbs to keep up the pace. And when one slowed, the whip cracked, leaving fresh lines of blood across backs already scarred by years of punishment. It was this man, the symbol of everything Malcolm hated, who would soon learn what it meant to face the same merciless hunger he had forced upon others. Malcolm had felt the sting of Dwyer's whip more times than he could count, his back a map of scars carved by cruelty. The overseer seemed to single him out, as though he sensed that beneath Malcolm's calm exterior lay a force waiting to erupt. That suspicion was not wrong, and it all came to a breaking point on a heavy Tuesday evening in late September, when the air was thick with moisture and the promise of a storm. Malcolm had been working late at the forge, repairing a damaged gear from the mill, when shouting carried across the night and torchlight flickered from the direction of the mansion. Sarah, a young woman, barely 19, came stumbling toward the forge. Her dress was torn, streaked with blood, her face swollen with shock and tears. Malcolm had known her since she was a child, had seen her spirit survive years of cruelty. But now she collapsed at his feet, her body trembling as though the weight of the world had finally broken her. In broken whispers, she told him what had happened. Dwyer had cornered her in the pantry while the family slept upstairs. He struck her when she resisted, splitting her lip, then forced himself upon her with violence and contempt. Her words tore through Malcolm like molten iron, each detail feeding a fire he had spent years containing. Rage rose inside him, uncontainable, until the mask of submission he had worn for survival slipped away. Sarah looked at him with eyes that no longer held hope, expecting comfort at best, silence at worst. Instead, what she saw in Malcolm's face was something else entirely. Calculation cold and steady, like frost spreading over glass. He helped her gently, offering water and a clean shirt, but as she washed, he moved with purpose. From beneath a pile of scrap iron, he pulled out chains he had been secretly forging for months. Unlike the crude shackles made for plantation use, these were crafted with extraordinary skill. Each link hardened to withstand impossible strain. They were not made for laborers, they were made for retribution. Sarah's confusion turned to silent understanding as she watched him work. He wasn't preparing to soothe her pain. He was preparing for war. Malcolm had studied Dwyer for years, watching his habits, learning his weaknesses. He knew the overseer's routine, and he knew Tuesday nights best of all. Every week, Dwyer ended the day by inspecting the sugar mill before retreating to his cabin, a private ritual that fed his sense of control. That night, Malcolm waited until the plantation lay silent. Every soul collapsed in exhausted sleep. The moon was smothered by clouds, the air heavy with the scent of rain. He moved through the darkness with the silence of a predator, his massive frame blending into the shadows as he approached the overseer's cabin. Though smaller than the grand mansion, Dwyer's quarters were still a mark of privilege, far more comfortable than the shacks endured by the enslaved. But to Malcolm, it was not a home. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. Inside the overseer's cabin, the life of Roderick Dwyer sat on display in cruel irony. A bed with clean sheets, a polished desk covered in neat records of punishments, and production shelves of books that Malcolm was forbidden to touch. And a bottle of whiskey that caught the moonlight like liquid fire. On the desk lay an unfinished letter to a brother in Georgia, the words of a man who thought his future was secure. Beside the bed, coiled on a hook, hung the whip. Its oiled leather darkened with stains and fragments of flesh, the instrument that had carved Malcolm's back into a map of suffering. Just the sight of it nearly shattered his resolve. But instead, it steeled him. Malcolm moved with the silence of a predator, the chains in his hands feeling alive, as though forged for this exact moment. When the cold iron touched Dwyer's skin, his eyes flew open. Confusion turned to horror as a massive hand smothered his mouth, cutting off the scream that might have brought help. The overseer recognized instantly who stood over him. For the first time in his life, he was the prey. Malcolm worked quickly, binding wrists and ankles with chains so strong they could have held a bull. The iron cut into soft, privileged flesh that had never known the bite of shackles, leaving welts that mirrored the scars on hundreds of backs Dwyer had whipped. Dragging him from the cabin was effortless, the man's frantic struggles powerless against the blacksmith's strength. His muffled cries vanished into the Louisiana night, swallowed by the chorus of insects and the low rumble of distant thunder. The sugar mill loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the horizon, its rollers gleaming in starlight like the teeth of some waiting beast. Malcolm chained Dwyer to the framework of the machine, positioning him so there could be no doubt about what was coming. The overseer's gray eyes, once cold and commanding, now brimmed with naked terror. Through a gag of torn cloth, he tried to plead, but his words had lost all meaning. Malcolm, calm and steady, explained the process in chilling detail, the way the rollers would seize him, the sound of bone grinding into pulp, the time it would take before there was nothing left but blood in the gears. Each word was deliberate, cruelly patient, giving Dwyer the same weapon he had always wielded: fear. The overseer trembled in his chains, learning at last what it meant to be powerless. Malcolm lit torches around the mill, and their glow transformed the place into a hellish stage. Shadows twisted across the gears, giving them the look of living things, hungry and eager. The blacksmith moved with ritual precision, oiling gears, testing rollers, setting the machine in motion as if preparing for another day's work. But tonight the harvest was not sugarcane, it was vengeance. Every step Malcolm took that morning carried the weight of inevitability. He moved with the measured calm of a craftsman, completing his masterpiece, even though the work before him was soaked in blood and retribution. The sunrise over the delta cast the sky in crimson hues, a fitting omen for what was to unfold. Dwyer, bound and broken, still thrashed weakly in his chains, eyes wide with a desperate hope that rescue might come. But no one stirred. No one came. The mill roared awake with a shudder that shook the ground, its gears and rollers grinding into motion with a force as unstoppable as the river's current. Steam hissed, metal groaned, and the entire machine seemed to breathe with a monstrous hunger. Malcolm placed Dwyer at the intake, the overseer's pleas reduced to guttural sounds behind the gag. The whipmaster, who had once wielded terror like a weapon, now flailed like an animal, sensing the slaughterhouse. Malcolm's deep voice cut through the mechanical roar, steady and unrelenting. He spoke of Sarah's tears, of the lashes carved into countless backs of children ripped from their mothers, and men driven to collapse in the fields. Each word was a litany of suffering carried on behalf of every enslaved soul whose voice had been silenced. Then the mechanism engaged. With a sickening crunch, the feed system dragged its captive forward. Dwyer's muffled screams rose to a shrill, inhuman pitch, his body convulsing as he realized the machine would not stop. The rollers seized him, indifferent and merciless, grinding flesh and bone as though he were nothing more than another stalk of cane. The sound shifted from mechanical to organic, a grotesque chorus of tearing, crushing, and the wet churn of life being reduced to pulp. Mist and steam rose from the chamber, carrying with it the sharp scent of blood, mingled with hot iron. The overseer who had ruled with cruelty was no more. When silence finally returned, Malcolm shut down the mill with practiced efficiency. The machine rested once again, its hunger sated its gears, streaked with crimson stains. He washed himself in the cooling water, deliberate and calm, as though cleaning up after a day's labor. There was no wild triumph in his expression, only a grim steadiness, the look of a man who had carried out a duty long overdue. As the plantation stirred awake in the pale light, Malcolm prepared to leave. He had always known this would be the price of justice. Dwyer's death would not go unnoticed, and white law would see it only as murder, never as retribution. Staying meant certain death not just for him, but likely for others. So he gathered what little he had, the chains that had become his weapons left behind as silent testimony. In that moment, Malcolm Harris was no longer just a blacksmith bound to a forge. He was a man stepping into freedom, his path uncertain, but his conscience unchained. From his hidden cache, Malcolm gathered the bundle he had prepared long before this night. Inside were the few possessions of a man who had lived his entire life, denied ownership of even himself. Tools of his craft, a handful of silver coins collected through quiet trade, and a crude but carefully drawn map of the Louisiana swamps that stretched beyond the plantation's eastern boundary. Those swamps were both peril and promise, a place where a man might vanish forever. Yet only if he possessed the knowledge and skill to survive their shifting waters, their snakes, their quicksand, their silence. Malcolm had studied them patiently, listening to stories from those who had passed briefly through on their way north. And now that knowledge would be his salvation. Before disappearing, he made one final stop. Sarah sat by her window in the dim light of dawn, her face pale and her eyes hollow with the kind of grief that eats away at hope. When she turned and saw him, She did not need words to understand. She rose, tears streaming freely, and embraced him with the desperate strength of someone who had lost too much already. Malcolm held her, then pressed into her hand a small iron token he had forged months earlier, etched with symbols that carried the promise of remembrance and protection. She clutched it to her chest, knowing it was more than a keepsake. It was proof that her suffering had been seen, acknowledged, and avenged. As the first voices of mourning stirred across the plantation, Malcolm Harris slipped into the wilderness, swallowed by the swamps like mist dissolving in the rising sun. Behind him, the sugar mill waited with its grisly secret. When dawn brought discovery, the plantation erupted in chaos. Overseer Roderick Dwyer, the terror of so many lives, had been reduced to blood and pulp by the very machine he once commanded. Richard Beaumont, the master of the plantation, was consumed by volcanic fury. His world, one built upon unquestioned dominance and control, had been fractured by the audacity of a single enslaved man. He ordered every cabin searched, every worker questioned, every trail hunted. Slave catchers were summoned, dogs, unleashed, rewards offered, and rumors chased. Yet Malcolm seemed to vanish into the swamps, as though nature itself had conspired to shelter him. Those who pursued him found only phantom trails, false leads, and the shifting dangers of the wetlands. Some never returned, swallowed by the wilderness. Others stumbled back, broken and shaken, whispering about shadows that moved like men, about sounds in the reeds that suggested watchful eyes. The story of what Malcolm had done could not be contained. It spread in whispers and hymns, woven into sermons and field songs, passed from one plantation to the next, like contraband hope. For the enslaved, Malcolm became more than a man. He was proof that overseers could fall, that chains could be broken, that justice could be carved from iron and delivered by fire. His name was spoken in hushed reverence, carved into bark, sung in secret gatherings until it grew beyond fact and became legend. The months rolled on. Spring softened into summer, and the cane fields rose once more, destined to be cut ground and boiled into sweetness for distant tables. The mill, scrubbed and repaired, resumed its work as though nothing had happened. But in the minds of those who labored under the lash, the mill no longer belonged solely to their oppressors. Its iron teeth had tasted retribution, and its stain could never be fully scrubbed away. Malcolm Harris had disappeared, but his story had taken root, and that story was something even Beaumont's power could never crush. The September night, when Malcolm Harris turned the overseer's whip against its master, left a mark that the plantation could never erase. From that morning forward, the workers carried themselves differently. Their movements, once weighed down by years of fear, now had a subtle steadiness. Their backs were straighter, their eyes sharper. Overseers noticed it too. They found themselves uneasy in the fields, starting at sudden noises, sleeping fitfully in beds that no longer felt like fortresses of power. Dwyer's death had cracked the illusion of invincibility. New overseers came and went. Some tried to rule with an iron hand, like Dwyer, only to be met with defiance they hadn't expected. Others, sensing the danger of cruelty, softened their grip, understanding that violence bred rebellion as surely as cane fields bred sugar. None, however, could recreate the reign of terror that had defined the plantation before that night. Sarah remained in the house, but she was no longer the fragile figure she had been. The fire in her had been rekindled, her quiet strength visible in every glance and gesture. She carried Malcolm's token, always the small piece of iron etched with symbols of protection and memory. A talisman that reminded her daily that her dignity had been defended, that she mattered enough for someone to risk everything. While the plantation shifted in atmosphere, Malcolm carved out a new existence in the wilds of the Louisiana swamps. What had seemed to his pursuers a maze of death and danger became in his hands a sanctuary. He built a shelter hidden among the cypress so well disguised it seemed a natural part of the landscape. From the swamp's resources, he fashioned a life of freedom. His blacksmith skill became his greatest ally. With salvaged metal and sheer ingenuity, he crafted tools, weapons, and traps that allowed him to survive where others would falter. His hands, once forced to shape chains, now shaped survival itself. The swamp provided abundantly for those who respected its laws. Malcolm learned its rhythms, the fish that filled its waters, the birds that nested in its trees, the plants that healed and nourished, the subtle signs that warned of storms. He mastered movement through its marshes without leaving a trace, becoming as much a part of the swamp as the shadows that slipped between the cypress knees. From time to time, other fugitives found their way to his refuge, guided by whispers of safe havens strung across the south like hidden pearls. Malcolm never turned them away. He gave shelter, food, and tools, teaching them how to read the swamp's secrets before sending them on to the next waypoint of freedom. He never pressed for stories, never judged the past they carried. To him, their survival was proof enough of their worth. Each person he aided was a quiet triumph over a system that had tried to strip them of humanity. Years passed, measured not in dates, but in the turning of seasons. Malcolm grew older, his hair silvering his body, weathered by the demands of the wilderness. Yet his spirit remained strong, unbroken, nourished by the life he had built and the justice he had claimed. Word of the outside world reached him in fragments carried by those who passed through. The slow boil of conflict between North and South had at last spilled over into war. The question of bondage, which had scarred his life from birth, was now tearing the nation apart. Malcolm listened to the news of battlefields and shifting lines, knowing that the struggle he had waged in secret swamps and midnight forges was now being fought openly across the land. And though he remained hidden in the wilderness, his story had already joined that greater war, a living legend of iron and fireproof, that the enslaved could fight back, and that even the most brutal system was not unbreakable. Malcolm heard the news of armies clashing across fields he once labored in, of plantations abandoned as their masters fled, of Union soldiers pushing deeper into the South. The world that had built his chains was collapsing under its own contradictions, a fire that no law or lash could contain. When word finally came that the war was over and that slavery had been abolished, Malcolm felt a storm of emotions. There was joy. Yes, joy for the millions freed at last. But there was also grief for the countless who had never lived to see that day, who had perished under the whip or the wheel, their lives consumed long before freedom reached them. For Malcolm, the knowledge that his act of defiance had been part of a greater tide gave new meaning to what he had done that September night. The world now called justice what the law would have once branded murder. History had vindicated his choice. Even after emancipation, Malcolm chose to remain in the swamps. What had once been refuge had become home. The wilderness had given him independence and peace that no piece of paper could bestow. He had forged a life on his own terms, bound only by the rhythms of water, wind, and stars. Visitors came sometimes in hushed groups, sometimes alone, searching for the man whose story had become legend, the blacksmith who had fed his overseer to the sugar mill. Around firelight that flickered against the ancient cypress, Malcolm welcomed them with quiet hospitality. He shared food tools and lessons of survival. He spoke little of that night, not because he regretted it, but because he preferred to teach what came after: the value of dignity, the cost of freedom, and the need for self-reliance. Some begged him to leave the swamp, to travel north to share his story openly, so that others could draw strength from his defiance. But Malcolm had no desire to rejoin the world of laws and hierarchies. Here he was, answerable only to himself. The swamp gave him something society never had: complete autonomy, an unbroken existence shaped by his own will. As decades passed, his tale became part of the oral tradition. Parents told their children of the blacksmith who turned the master's tools against the master, who fed cruelty to the very machine it had used to destroy others. The sugar mill itself was eventually dismantled. Its bloody rollers melted into new metal for a new age. But people remembered what had once happened in its shadow. They remembered that sometimes justice required more than patience, that sometimes cruelty could only be answered by carefully chosen violence. Malcolm Harris lived quietly in his hidden sanctuary until the age of 78. He died beneath the cypress trees that had sheltered him for nearly 30 years, his body buried in the soil of the island he had claimed as his own. His bones returned to the earth, claimed by the roots, folded into the endless cycle of life and renewal. But his story did not end there. It lived on in whispers, in songs, in stories passed down through generations. To those who needed hope, Malcolm's tale was more than memory, it was proof. Proof that even the strongest chains could be broken, that cruelty would one day meet its reckoning, and that somewhere someone would always be willing to risk everything for the sake of human dignity. The tale of Malcolm of Louisiana was no longer just history. It had become legend. Malcolm Harris did not simply fade into history, he transformed into something larger than life. His tale became mythology, a story whispered in fields and passed down at firesides, reminding people that even in the darkest chapters of humanity, there are always those unwilling to bow to injustice. His hammer may have fallen silent and his forge long grown cold, but the legacy he left behind continued to ignite sparks in those who faced their own battles against systems that sought to strip away dignity and reduce people to little more than property on a ledger. What set Malcolm apart was not just the vengeance he carried out, but the life he built afterward. He had achieved what few men in any age ever manage: complete freedom lived entirely on his own terms, guided only by his conscience. His violence had meaning, his justice had weight, and his freedom was not something a law or government could give or take away. The sugar mill that ended Roderick Dwyer's life eventually crumbled into obscurity, its machinery dismantled and sold as scrap. But Malcolm, the man who turned that mill into an altar of reckoning, became immortal in memory. Wherever people remembered that oppression always carries the seeds of its own destruction, his name was spoken. Years later, researchers piecing together fragments of his life uncovered the true depth of his influence. Hidden caches revealed that Malcolm's swamp refuge had not been merely a place of survival, but a vital node in the Underground Railroad of the Deep South. The maps he created, waterproofed and meticulously detailed, showed secret waterways and hidden paths through the bayous. They had guided hundreds to freedom-saving lives while confounding the very men sent to hunt him. Archaeologists found remnants of his forge evidence that he had not only crafted tools for survival, but also weapons for defense and escape. His metalwork bore the precision of a master, improved rather than diminished by his years of isolation. Among the discoveries were towering iron sculptures, some more than 6 feet high, depicting scenes of liberation, triumph, and resilience. These works of art, hidden away in his sanctuary, suggested Malcolm had found a voice beyond rebellion, a spiritual expression forged from iron pain and hope. Folklore, too, kept his spirit alive. In the Cajun settlements along the swamp's edges, people told stories of the Iron Ghost, a giant who shaped metal with his bare hands and punished those who preyed on the weak. Children grew up hearing tales of a protector who dwelled among the cypress trees, a phantom whose wrath could awaken mechanical demons to devour the cruel. These stories woven into the culture blurred the line between myth and memory. Beyond Louisiana, his influence spread in subtle but powerful ways. Plantation blacksmiths, inspired by Malcolm's defiance, began embedding hidden symbols in the shackles and chains they were ordered to forge. Some deliberately weakened the iron, creating flaws that turned restraints into opportunities for escape. Others passed along intelligence about patrols and safe routes, transforming their craft into an act of quiet rebellion. In doing so, they kept alive the spirit of the man who had once turned bondage into justice. The psychological tremors of Malcolm's act rippled across the South. Overseers who once walked with unchecked arrogance now found themselves haunted by the memory of Dwyer's fate. The myth of white invulnerability had been shattered, and enslaved people looked upon their oppressors with new eyes, seeing not gods, but fragile men of flesh and bone. Plantation masters answered with greater violence and surveillance, yet the harder they clamped down, the more appealing Malcolm's example became. His story proved that resistance was not futile. It was possible. And once that truth took root, it could never again be uprooted. Malcolm Harris lived and died in the swamps buried beneath cypress trees, but his legacy endured. His name etched into memory and myth carried forward as proof that justice, no matter how delayed or costly, always comes. He had shown that a single act carefully planned and carried out with conviction could fracture an empire of cruelty. And in the telling of his story, generation after generation found courage, defiance, and the unshakable belief that no system of oppression lasts forever. The aftermath of Malcolm Harris's rebellion rippled far beyond the bloodstains on the rollers of a Louisiana sugar mill. What began as one man's act of vengeance soon translated into a measurable economic shock across the South. Workers, emboldened by his example, carried themselves differently. Fear gave way to subtle defiance tools. Broke more often, equipment malfunctioned at suspiciously convenient times. Harvests dragged behind schedule, and overseers found themselves unable to command the same terrified obedience that had once made plantations efficient engines of profit. Planters felt the change in their ledgers before they admitted it in their hearts. Insurance companies, recognizing the heightened risk of rebellion, raised premiums for plantation operations. Investors who once considered human bondage a secure return began to withdraw their money, shifting toward the safer promise of northern industry. What had seemed an unshakable system began to creak under pressure, not only from external politics and looming war, but from within, weakened by resistance that could no longer be contained. Malcolm's chains had not only bound a single overseer, they had fractured the foundation of an entire economic order. Historians would later debate the size of his contribution to slavery's collapse, but no serious voice denied his symbolic power. Malcolm had shown in visceral, undeniable terms that the master-slave relationship was not ordained by God or nature. It was a construct of men, and what men had built, men could also destroy. His hammer had forged more than iron, it had forged a new consciousness. In the stories retold across cabins, churches, and swamps, chains became weapons machinery, became judgment, and the enslaved began to see themselves not as powerless, but as capable of striking back. Even the swamps that sheltered him retained an almost sacred aura after his death. Long after the Underground Railroad had ceased to function, people visited those waterways as though they were hallowed ground, drawing inspiration from the place where Malcolm had carved out his freedom. During Reconstruction, when newly freed people faced lynch mobs, disenfranchisement, and the rising terror of the Ku Klux Klan, his legend offered reassurance that resistance had always been possible. Preachers in black churches wove his story into sermons, likening his defiance to the Exodus, comparing his chains repurposed for justice to Moses' staff striking against Pharaoh's power. As the South industrialized in the decades after the Civil War, Malcolm's symbolism evolved with the times. Former field hands who now labored in textile mills and steel foundries brought his story into the new workplaces. The blacksmith who turned the master's machine into an instrument of liberation became a patron saint of sorts for labor struggles. His revenge on the overseer was retold as a parable for workers crushed by unsafe conditions and starvation wages. If the sugar mill could consume its master, so too could the industrial machine devour those who abused it. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, labor organizers invoked his name at rallies, invoking not just a story of racial resistance, but of human defiance against exploitation in every form. Remember the mill, they would say, a shorthand warning of what happens when those who profit from suffering push too far. The lesson endured: every system that treats human beings as disposable parts of a machine carries within it the seeds of its own collapse. Malcolm Harris had shown that truth in Iron and Blood, and his legacy carried forward long after his body returned to the roots of the cypress. Strike leaders, labor organizers, and later civil rights activists carried Malcolm Harris's story like a torch into every era of struggle. Around campfires in union halls and during marches, they retold the tale of the blacksmith who refused to accept injustice, who turned the master's machine into a weapon of justice. His story became both a warning to those in power and a rallying cry for those who felt powerless, proof that no system of oppression was beyond breaking. It reminded the downtrodden that even the most entrenched hierarchies carried within themselves the cracks of their own destruction. For a long time, academic historians dismissed Malcolm's story as myth too dramatic and poetic to be real. They labeled it folklore, an exaggerated fable meant to inspire enslaved communities, rather than a factual record. This skepticism mirrored a broader trend in historical scholarship that favored narratives portraying slavery as a civilizing institution, downplaying resistance in favor of paternalistic accounts written by enslavers themselves. But in the 20th century, as the civil rights movement demanded a fuller, truer accounting of African American history, the tide shifted. Researchers began to take oral traditions seriously, treating them not as fantasy, but as vital records of truth preserved by communities whose voices had been silenced in official archives. Archaeological digs in the Louisiana bayous began uncovering physical evidence that gave weight to the old tales. Excavations of Malcolm's hidden refuge revealed a forge and workshop that displayed a level of metalwork skill rivaling that of any free artisan in the cities. Tools and weapons found there showed remarkable ingenuity and adaptation, suggesting that enslaved blacksmiths like Malcolm had long been underestimated, their talents stifled by a system that denied them ownership of their craft. Carbon dating confirmed continuous habitation of the site during the very years Malcolm was said to have lived there. Geological analysis of the iron used in his forge indicated ore sources that could only have been obtained through networks of allies and collaborators. Far from being an isolated fugitive, Malcolm had maintained connections and actively contributed to the larger struggle for freedom. These discoveries raised profound questions about the scale of resistance networks in the antebellum South. If one man could build such a sophisticated refuge and contribute so substantially to the Underground Railroad, how many others had done so in secret, leaving little trace for official records? The implications forced a reconsideration of slavery's history, undermining the old portrayal of enslaved people as passive victims and illuminating their role as active agents in their own liberation. Modern forensic analysis of the Beaumont plantation records deepened this re-evaluation. Insurance claims filed by Richard Beaumont after Dwyer's death described damages far greater than the official story had ever admitted. Fires had destroyed outbuildings. Equipment failures had paralyzed operations for months. The evidence suggested deliberate sabotage, coordinated resistance, rather than the isolated act of one man. Malcolm may have struck the blow, but the plantations' enslaved community had quietly fanned the flames. Even more chilling were the findings from unmarked graves near the plantation. DNA analysis revealed the remains of multiple individuals who had died violently in the months following Malcolm's rebellion. Their injuries bore the unmistakable signs of torture and execution, grim testimony to Beaumont's fury and the lengths to which enslavers went to reassert control. Official records had whitewashed this violence, but the bones told a story of brutal reprisals, of collective punishment for daring to question authority. Together, these discoveries transformed Malcolm's tale from a singular story of vengeance into something larger. Evidence of a broader rebellion, a coordinated act of defiance that shook the foundations of slavery. His life in the swamps, his legend as the Iron Ghost, and his role in inspiring resistance were not isolated myth, but part of a continuum of collective struggle. In this light, Malcolm Harris was not just one man who struck back. He was the embodiment of a truth that slavery's defenders had always feared. The system was fragile, its authority vulnerable, and its victims were never as powerless as they were made to seem. The fact that others had died in the wake of Malcolm's rebellion only magnified his stature. He was no longer just a fugitive blacksmith who had escaped bondage. He became a symbol for the cost and courage of resistance itself, proof that his act of defiance had set ripples in motion that claimed lives but also inspired generations. His story leapt from whispered memory into the wider current of culture shaping literature, music, art, and eventually global movements for justice. During the Harlem Renaissance, writers drew heavily from his example, crafting characters and narratives rooted in the idea of enslaved people as agents of their own destiny. Malcolm's journey from the forge to the swamp became a blueprint for stories of dignity, reclaimed justice demanded, and the transformative force of righteous anger. Poets invoked the rhythm of his hammer as the beat of defiance, while novelists painted his swamp refuge as a hidden kingdom where freedom thrived beyond the reach of empire. Musicians carried his legend even further. In gospel songs, his hammer strokes became the rhythm of deliverance. In blues, the grinding roar of the sugar mill was reimagined as the percussion of justice swallowing cruelty whole. These songs, passed down through work chants, church choirs, and traveling performers, ensured that even those who never read a word of his story could feel its weight in melody and rhythm. Malcolm's rebellion was not just remembered, it was sung into the DNA of African American communities where music was the heartbeat of survival. Visual artists, too, found in his tale a canvas of contrasts. Paintings and sculptures depicted the towering figure of the blacksmith standing against the cold mechanical jaws of the mill, turning the imagery into a meditation on humanity versus machinery, flesh versus steel, freedom versus control. His act of binding an overseer in chains forged by his own hands became one of the most powerful images of reversal in all of American art, the enslaved transforming the tools of oppression into instruments of justice. For children growing up under Jim Crow, Malcolm's legend became a lifeline. In a world where segregation and disenfranchisement reminded them daily that freedom was still conditional, the story of the blacksmith who refused to accept his fate offered proof that defiance was possible. School teachers in black communities began incorporating his example into lessons, presenting him as a historical figure whose courage could be emulated. By showing students that their ancestors had not simply endured, but fought back, Malcolm's story dismantled stereotypes and instilled pride. His influence stretched beyond America's borders as abolitionists and human rights activists shared his tale across oceans. His story resonated with laborers in Caribbean cane fields, with colonized peoples in Africa and Asia, with anyone forced into systems of exploitation that claimed inevitability as their greatest weapon. Malcolm's rebellion revealed that inevitability was a lie. No system, however entrenched, was immune to the strike of a single hammer, the courage of a single act. By the time the 20th century reached its most turbulent decades, Malcolm Harris was no longer just a man or even a legend. He was a universal symbol. His life told the world that oppression always contained its own breaking point, and that justice, however delayed, would always come to claim its debt. Translations of Malcolm Harris's story carried his defiance far beyond the Louisiana bayous, reshaping struggles for freedom in lands he would never see. Revolutionary leaders in Haiti, Cuba, and across the Caribbean invoked his rebellion as proof that the enslaved could turn the master's tools against the master himself. His tale was retold as allegory and warning, echoing through movements that sought to dismantle colonial rule and replace systems of exploitation with communities grounded in equality and dignity. In Africa and Asia, anti-colonial activists found the same lessons in his life: that oppression was never eternal, that courage and resolve could topple even the mightiest empires, and that liberation was as much about seizing agency as it was about winning battles. As industrialization transformed economies, Malcolm's story took on new significance. The sugar mill, once remembered as a machine that consumed the bodies of enslaved workers, became a metaphor for the soulless gears of modern industry. Labor leaders used his story to highlight how factory machinery like plantation rollers treated workers as disposable parts in systems that valued efficiency over humanity. His rebellion stood as a reminder that people must always resist being reduced to mere inputs in someone else's profit calculus. Injured factory workers, struggling unions, and social critics all found in Malcolm's legend a rallying cry: no machine, however vast or powerful, could erase the dignity of human lives if those lives refused to be crushed in silence. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Malcolm's connection to the land itself gained renewed meaning. The Louisiana swamps that had hidden him became symbols of sanctuary and sustainability. Environmental activists pointed to his refuge as an early model of living in harmony with natural systems while resisting exploitation. Indigenous communities and climate justice advocates embraced his example, drawing parallels between his swamp survival and their own fights against corporate encroachment, pollution, and forced displacement. As rising seas and industrial expansion devoured wetlands, activists argued that the destruction of places like Malcolm's Island was not only an ecological loss, but also an erasure of historic safe havens for the oppressed. This, they said, was environmental racism, made visible the loss of natural sanctuaries that had once offered escape routes and independence for people denied safety elsewhere. The spiritual legacy of Malcolm's life grew alongside its political and cultural power. Preachers in black churches compared his journey to the Exodus, casting him as a modern Moses who had faced down Pharaoh's lash and lived to claim freedom in a promised land of his own making. Later generations of religious and philosophical movements drew upon his story as a meditation on justice, resilience, and the possibility of transformation through struggle. To some, he was a saint of resistance; to others, a prophet of liberation; and to still others, a living embodiment of the truth that salvation, whether political or spiritual, is often forged in fire and blood. New Age spiritualists embraced Malcolm Harris as a figure who embodied the possibility of transforming rage into creation, of channeling destructive energy into purposeful healing action. They saw in his bond with the Louisiana swamplands a model of spiritual alignment with nature, an example of how survival could become a sacred act when rooted in respect for natural systems. Traditional African religious practitioners viewed his mastery of ironwork not just as craft, but as ritual, a continuation of ancestral wisdom, where iron was both a tool of survival and a conduit of spiritual power. Teachers in Buddhist and Hindu traditions drew on Malcolm's story to illustrate karma. The overseer Roderick Dwyer reaped precisely what he had sown. His cruelty mirrored back upon him by the mill's cold machinery. The precision with which the machine converted his violence into his own destruction became a striking metaphor for natural laws that transcend human hierarchies, showing that no system of domination could escape the eventual consequences of its actions. Indigenous leaders, meanwhile, compared Malcolm's exile in the swamps to vision quests where solitude in wild places becomes a path to wisdom. His evolution from enraged avenger into a gray-haired guide for others mirrored rites of passage in native traditions where trials in nature refine the self into a source of knowledge and strength for the community. Legal scholars also turned to Malcolm's story when grappling with the boundaries of justified resistance. His rebellion became a case study in the ethics of violence. What happens when legal systems are themselves engines of injustice? When the law exists not to protect, but to dehumanize professors of constitutional law, used his story to force students into hard questions. Did Malcolm have the right or even the duty to resist? Was violence inevitable when nonviolent avenues were closed? His act of chaining Dwyer and feeding him to the mill became an unsettling but unavoidable example of the tension between legal obedience and moral duty. In international law, his example echoed in the framing of human rights declarations that affirmed the right of conscience resistance and refusal to participate in systems that perpetuated slavery, genocide, or crimes against humanity. Psychologists and trauma researchers found in Malcolm's story a profound window into survival and resilience. His life revealed the damage inflicted by systemic violence, but also the extraordinary capacity for what would later be termed post-traumatic growth. By transforming his pain into decisive, purposeful action, by reclaiming agency and dignity through his rebellion, Malcolm modeled a path from victimhood to empowerment. His journey showed that trauma, while devastating, could also forge strength when channeled toward justice. The therapeutic power of his story extended far beyond individuals. Communities scarred by slavery, racial violence, or genocide drew strength from his example. To hear of Malcolm Harris was to be reminded that even the most dehumanizing oppression could not erase the human spirit, and that healing often began in the moment when dignity was reclaimed through action. His story became not just history or legend, but medicine, a collective reminder that justice, resistance, and renewal are essential to survival. The story of Malcolm Harris carried meaning not just as history or legend, but as a living tool for healing and understanding. For communities long battered by stereotypes and systemic racism, his example stood as proof that their ancestors were not passive sufferers, but active agents of change who resisted, fought, and sometimes won. Educational psychologists noted that young people exposed to stories like Malcolm's performed better academically and held stronger cultural identities. By seeing figures from their own heritage cast as heroes rather than victims, they shed internalized narratives of inferiority and replaced them with confidence and pride. Malcolm's life demonstrated that intelligence, creativity, and moral courage were never the monopoly of dominant groups, but human qualities present in every community, regardless of race, class, or history. Economists studying the legacy of slavery found in Malcolm's rebellion a vivid case study of its hidden inefficiencies. The system demanded constant surveillance patrols, punishments, and terror to suppress uprisings. Resources that drained profits and undermined productivity. While plantation records presented slavery as profitable, modern analysis revealed how much of its apparent wealth came from ignoring human suffering and the broader costs of social disruption. By forcing planters to pour money into security after his escape, Malcolm's defiance exposed these cracks, proving how a single act of resistance could ripple outward, reshaping the entire economic calculus of oppression. His story illustrated the concept of externalized costs, the truth that systems of exploitation appear profitable only when they shift the real burdens onto the bodies and spirits of those they oppress. Labor economists later drew lessons from his life about worker agency and the risks of treating people as expendable. Malcolm had been a blacksmith of rare skill, a craftsman whose labor represented immense human capital. When he fled, that knowledge was lost to the plantation, wasted by a system too blind to value his abilities, except as tools of control. In the swamps, freed from that bondage, his talents blossomed. His metallurgical innovations and engineering adaptations revealed the untapped reservoir of creativity suppressed by slavery. In him, scholars saw evidence that the South's reliance on bondage had weakened it, choking off intellectual and technological advances that might have flourished if millions of enslaved people had been allowed to apply their skills freely. Malcolm's story also bridged into contemporary debates about exploitation and trafficking. Activists saw in him a mirror for the struggles of vulnerable populations still trapped in forced labor, debt bondage, and systems that deny human dignity across the globe. His defiance became a timeless reminder: oppression, no matter its form, is never absolute. The same ingenuity, courage, and determination that carried him through the fires of slavery still lives in those who resist exploitation today. His hammer had not just shaped chains or weapons, it had shaped a vision of freedom that transcended time. It showed that systems built on human suffering are not inevitable, not eternal, but fragile structures vulnerable to the courage of those they seek to break. In that truth, Malcolm Harris became more than a blacksmith of iron. He became a blacksmith of possibility, forging lessons for future generations in fire steel and unyielding will. Human rights activists drew powerful lessons from Malcolm Harris's life, recognizing in the plantation system that had trapped him the same dynamics of exploitation that persist today in debt bondage, sex trafficking, and forced labor hidden within global supply chains. His act of rebellion and his years of self-sustained freedom in the swamps offered a model for modern anti-trafficking efforts that emphasize empowerment over rescue. Malcolm's story showed that even the most oppressed individuals possess knowledge, strength, and ingenuity that can be mobilized to resist exploitation if they are given tools, support, and the chance to act as agents of their own liberation. Prison reform advocates likewise found his story hauntingly relevant. In Louisiana, prisons were built on the sites of old plantations, where predominantly African American inmates were forced into labor for the profit of private companies, a chilling echo of slavery by another name. Malcolm's chains became symbolic not only of bondage on the plantation, but also of the modern systems of incarceration that disproportionately ensnared communities of color, stripping them of opportunity and cycling them into the school-to-prison pipeline. Reformers invoked his example to argue for a system rooted not in punishment and exploitation, but in rehabilitation, restoration, and dignity. Immigration rights activists found in Malcolm's journey a powerful analogy for the struggles of undocumented workers, asylum seekers, and refugees. Just as the Underground Railroad offered sanctuary to enslaved people fleeing bondage, so too have modern sanctuary movements sheltered immigrants from deportation and separation. Malcolm's defiance reminded them that the fight for justice has always required courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to confront laws that enshrine cruelty. His example encouraged them to see their efforts not as isolated struggles, but as part of a long tradition of resistance against unjust systems. Across the globe, Malcolm's story has been translated into new languages, retold in new cultural contexts and carried forward by educators, activists, and ordinary people who find in him both inspiration and practical wisdom. His rebellion spoke not only to the horrors of slavery, but to universal human truths that oppression can be resisted, that creativity flourishes even in chains, and that transformation is always possible. His hammer shaped more than iron. It shaped visions of freedom, possibilities for resistance and courage that could not be extinguished by violence or forgotten by time. In the end, Malcolm Harris achieved a form of immortality no monument could capture. He lived on, in the countless lives reshaped by the knowledge that one man, by refusing to accept injustice as inevitable, proved that freedom was never an unreachable dream. It was always possible for anyone willing to seize it with the same fire skill and unbreakable will that had once turned a sugar mill into a weapon of justice.